Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in the small rural town of La Crosse County, Wisconsin. Known later as the Butcher of Plainfield, Gein's early life appeared, at least superficially, unremarkable to the outside world. However, beneath the veneer of a quiet rural upbringing, seeds of darkness were being planted, shaped by a unique confluence of family dynamics, religious fanaticism, and social isolation. Understanding Gein's childhood is crucial for unraveling the psychological and environmental factors that would later inform his horrific actions. Edward, or Ed as he would later be known, was the middle child of George and Augusta Gein. He had an older brother, Henry, and a younger brother, Frank, forming a small nuclear family of 5. George Gein was a stern, hard-working farmer who spent long hours tending to the farm, instilling in his children a sense of practical labor and self-sufficiency. Yet it was Augusta, Ed's mother, who exerted the most profound influence on him. Augusta Gein was a deeply religious woman, belonging to a strain of Protestantism that emphasized sin, punishment, and the moral corruption of the flesh. She viewed the world as inherently sinful and believed that women, in particular, were dangerous seductresses capable of leading men to damnation. This belief became a central pillar in her interactions with her children, especially Edward. Augusta instilled in him a profound fear of women and sexuality, framing these natural aspects of life as morally corrupt and spiritually dangerous. This religious dogmatism was combined with intense control, effectively isolating her children from normal social interactions and enforcing strict obedience. The Gein household was a place of rigid discipline and emotional repression. Augusta's domination left little room for emotional warmth, affection, or encouragement. She frequently criticized and punished the children for minor infractions and constantly reminded them of the sinful nature of the world. This upbringing had a profound impact on young Ed, who internalized feelings of fear, guilt, and inadequacy. According to later psychological analyses, children raised in such environments often develop a complex mixture of fear, anxiety, and suppressed desires, conditions that can contribute to deviant behavior later in life. George Gein, while present, was a relatively passive figure. He worked long hours on the farm and deferred household management to Augusta. Though he maintained authority in some aspects of family life, he did little to mitigate the psychological and emotional toll his wife's strict religious rules imposed on the children. For Ed, the maternal figure was dominant, and the absence of paternal intervention allowed Augusta's beliefs to shape his worldview almost entirely. Social isolation further compounded these pressures. The Gein family lived on a remote farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin, miles away from neighbors and any sense of community. The children had little contact with peers or outside influences. For Edward, this meant that his understanding of the world, particularly of social norms, female relationships, and sexuality, was filtered almost entirely through the lens of his mother's extreme beliefs. He developed a warped perception of women, seeing them simultaneously as figures to be feared, idealized, and in some subconscious way, controlled. Reports from acquaintances and local residents suggest that young Ed was an introverted and somewhat peculiar child. He exhibited early signs of social awkwardness, preferring the solitude of the farm to the company of other children. He was deeply curious, often exploring the property, woods, and barns, but his interests were frequently tinged with morbid curiosity. In a household where moral sin was constantly emphasized, he learned to suppress ordinary impulses, storing his curiosities and desires inward, a psychological mechanism that would later manifest in macabre ways. Education offered little relief or social exposure. Ed attended local schools, but his academic record was unremarkable. Teachers remembered him as polite but withdrawn, rarely engaging with classmates. The combination of his mother's oppressive moral teachings and the lack of peer interaction reinforced his social isolation. He had few, if any, friendships, and his play often consisted of solitary activities, including observing the natural environment and, later, exploring graveyards, places that fascinated him from a young age. A particularly significant aspect of Ed's childhood was his mother's constant vilification of women. Augusta Gein often lectured her children on the dangers of female sexuality, emphasizing that women were deceitful, manipulative, and morally corrupt. She painted vivid pictures of the eternal damnation that awaited sinners, particularly those who succumbed to lust or desire. For Ed, these lessons were internalized in a literal and profound way, creating a conflicted relationship with his own emerging sexual impulses. Over time, he would develop a disturbing pattern. Simultaneously repulsed by women yet obsessed with controlling, emulating, or possessing them in highly distorted forms. The death of Ed's father in 1940, though occurring later in his life, would leave Augusta as the uncontested authority figure. However, even before George's passing, Augusta's dominance had already imposed lasting psychological effects. Ed's identity and worldview had been so thoroughly shaped by maternal control that he struggled to form independent moral judgments or emotional boundaries. He lacked the typical social frameworks that might have mitigated or channeled his impulses into normal behavior. Another key influence was the rural environment itself. Life on the farm demanded self-sufficiency and isolation. Children were expected to contribute to labor, learn practical skills, and endure hardships. For Ed, the farm provided both a playground and a laboratory. He spent hours observing animals, dissecting carcasses, and experimenting with materials found on the property. While seemingly innocuous, these activities honed his fascination with anatomy, mortality, and the physicality of the human body, interests that, in a different context, might have led to a career in medicine or biology, but in Ed's psychological context, would later manifest in horrifying ways. It was also during these formative years that Ed developed habits of secrecy and concealment. The strict moral codes enforced by Augusta meant that natural impulses, curiosity, desire, or anger had to be suppressed. He learned to hide not only actions but thoughts, creating an internal world inaccessible to others. Such internalization is common in individuals who later engage in deviant behavior, as it fosters a disconnect between private desires and public morality. In Ed's case, this disconnect would become absolute, culminating in acts that shocked even the most hardened observers. Despite his social isolation, Ed was not entirely removed from the wider cultural context of early 20th century America. He would have been aware, at least peripherally, of popular culture, local events, and national developments. Yet his interactions with society were filtered through the lens of fear and moral judgment instilled by his mother. As a result, his engagement with the outside world was superficial, analytical, and often marked by detachment. This detachment allowed him to view human behavior from a distorted, almost clinical perspective, setting the stage for the methodical and cold-blooded nature of his later crimes. By the end of the 1920s, Ed Gein had entered adulthood physically but remained psychologically tethered to his mother's teachings. He had developed a set of internalized beliefs about morality, sin, and the nature of women, combined with intense curiosity about death and the human body. These characteristics, when combined with social isolation and limited emotional outlets, created a perfect storm for deviant behavior. Observers might have seen him as an odd, reclusive man on the fringes of the community, but beneath the surface, a deeply disturbed psyche was taking shape, a psyche that would later lead to some of the most infamous crimes in American history. Ed Gein's teenage years were a continuation of the isolation, repression, and moral rigidity that had defined his childhood. Between the ages of 14 and 18, Ed experienced a period of emotional turmoil that, while appearing mundane to outsiders, revealed early indicators of the psychological disturbances that would later define his adult life. These formative years were crucial for shaping his obsessions, fears, and his eventual descent into criminality. Despite living in a rural environment, Ed's adolescent world was constricted almost entirely to the family farm and its surrounding areas. Interaction with peers was minimal. Socialization outside the home was sporadic and generally limited to obligatory school attendance. Ed's awkwardness and peculiar interests contributed to his alienation. Unlike other boys his age, who were forming friendships and exploring social bonds, Ed was preoccupied with solitary activities that included observing animal carcasses, dissecting small animals, and experimenting with various mechanical and chemical processes on the farm. While these activities were not inherently criminal, they reflected a fascination with anatomy and mortality that would later manifest in profoundly disturbing ways. One of the defining aspects of Ed's adolescence was the intensification of his mother's influence. Augusta Gein's rigid religious teachings did not wane as her children grew older, rather, they became more pronounced. She frequently lectured Ed on the dangers of sexual immorality and the sinful nature of human desire. These lessons were reinforced through fear, often dramatized with vivid descriptions of eternal damnation. For a young man undergoing the natural process of sexual development, these messages created profound confusion. Ed internalized a sense of guilt and fear regarding his own sexual impulses, while simultaneously developing morbid curiosity about the very acts he was being told were sinful. This psychological conflict became particularly evident in Ed's private behavior. While there are no recorded incidents of sexual activity during his teenage years, He began experimenting with the concept of controlling and possessing female forms through imaginative and later macabre means. His fascination with death and anatomy intertwined with sexual curiosity, laying the foundation for the necrophilic tendencies that would later become infamous. ED's internal world was shaped by both fear and desire, creating a complex psychological landscape in which normative moral boundaries were blurred. ED's educational experience during adolescence further reinforced his isolation. He was an average student academically, though his teachers noticed a tendency toward withdrawn behavior and daydreaming. He rarely engaged in sports or social clubs, preferring solitary walks in the woods, observing wildlife, or performing meticulous tasks on the family farm. His classmates often regarded him as odd or eccentric, which only deepened his sense of separation from the community. Around this time, ED's relationship with his mother became even more controlling. Augusta monitored his movements, limited his social interactions, and imposed strict rules about behavior and conduct. This intense oversight fostered not only obedience but also secrecy. Ed learned to hide his thoughts, desires, and burgeoning curiosities from the outside world, cultivating an internal life in which he could explore the forbidden without consequence. This duality, public compliance paired with private obsession, would later define his criminal methodology. Another significant element of ED's adolescence was his fascination with death and cemeteries. It is reported that he began spending considerable time wandering local graveyards, observing the dead and imagining scenarios involving the deceased. Unlike typical morbid curiosity, ED's interest was analytical and obsessive. He catalogued gravestones, studied the positioning of corpses, and considered the physical properties of the bodies he saw. This behavior, while initially unnoticed by the community, foreshadowed the grave-robbing activities for which he would later become infamous. During his teenage years, Ed also demonstrated a peculiar relationship with female figures in his life. While he was repulsed by women due to his mother's teachings, he simultaneously idealized them in a distorted way. He began collecting images of women from magazines and newspapers, studying them meticulously. This practice, seemingly innocuous, was symptomatic of a deeper psychological pattern: the desire to possess and control female forms while remaining unable to engage with real women socially or emotionally. The dichotomy of fear and obsession would intensify in adulthood, ultimately manifesting in acts of extreme violence and necrophilia. ED's adolescence was also marked by a growing preoccupation with crafting objects from unusual materials. On the farm, he experimented with tools, wood, and animal hides. These skills, while practical in a rural context, later provided the technical foundation for creating grotesque items from human remains. This period can be seen as a critical phase in the development of ED's methodical approach to his crimes. He was learning not only precision and patience but also the ability to manipulate physical materials in ways that would later facilitate his macabre experiments. Social isolation, fear, and obsessive curiosity converged to create a uniquely disturbed adolescent profile. While many young people navigate similar periods of confusion and rebellion, ED's experiences were magnified by his extreme upbringing, rural seclusion, and the psychological imprint of his mother's authoritarian control. These factors combined to produce a mind capable of compartmentalizing morality, desire, and fantasy, a psychological mechanism that would later underpin his notorious criminal acts. ED's early encounters with mortality and the human body were not limited to observation. He began experimenting with exhumed animal carcasses, dissecting them to understand anatomy. This practice, though not yet directed at humans, reflected an intense fascination with death as a physical, manipulable phenomenon. His isolation meant that these behaviors went largely unchecked, allowing them to evolve unchecked into more elaborate and dangerous forms. By the early 1940s, Ed had fully entered adulthood physically but remained psychologically tethered to the patterns established in his adolescence. He was socially inept, emotionally stunted, and profoundly affected by his mother's teachings. His private world was rich with morbid fantasies and obsessive thoughts, yet outwardly he appeared as a quiet, unremarkable man on the fringes of the Plainfield community. This duality, ordinary appearance masking extraordinary inner disturbance, would later allow him to perpetrate crimes with a chilling lack of detection. It is also during this period that Ed began exhibiting early signs of compulsive behaviors that would later become central to his criminal acts. He displayed an increasing interest in death-related paraphernalia, collecting items associated with funerary practices and graveyards. Reports suggest that he experimented with taxidermy techniques on animals, seeking to understand the preservation of bodies. While these activities were still legal and contained within the realm of hobbyist behavior, they reveal a mind increasingly preoccupied with control over death and the physicality of the human form. These formative experiences illustrate a trajectory in which environmental, familial, and personal factors converge to produce a deeply disturbed individual. The combination of maternal control, social isolation, obsession with death, and early experimentation with dissection and anatomical study created a psychological profile characterized by repression, fixation, and a desire for control. In hindsight, the signs of future deviance were clear. EDS adolescence was marked by behaviors and interests that, while superficially innocuous, were building toward acts of extreme criminality. By the mid-1940s, Ed Gein was on the precipice of the life-altering events that would define his notoriety. His adolescence, characterized by secrecy, obsession, and fear, had cultivated the cognitive and emotional patterns necessary for his later crimes. The foundation had been laid for a transition from morbid curiosity to actual criminal activity, setting the stage for one of the most infamous cases in American history. The death of Augusta Gein in 1945 marked a pivotal turning point in Edward Gein's life. For nearly 4 decades, Augusta had been the dominant force in EDS world, a figure of rigid moral authority whose teachings and fear tactics shaped the very framework of his mind. Her passing left a void, both emotionally and psychologically, that Edward struggled to navigate. The absence of her oppressive control unleashed both freedom and chaos, exposing the fragile and disturbed architecture of his psyche. At the time of his mother's death, Edward was in his late 30s, a man physically mature but psychologically stunted. The influence of Augusta had created a deeply dependent individual, one whose understanding of morality, women, and social norms was dictated entirely by maternal authority. Without her constant supervision, Ed was confronted with the freedom to act upon the suppressed desires and curiosities that had festered throughout his adolescence and early adulthood. This period of newfound autonomy coincided with a burgeoning fascination with death, anatomy, and the control of female forms, setting the stage for the series of actions that would later define his criminal legacy. Following Augusta's funeral, Ed retreated further into the family home in Plainfield, Wisconsin. He became reclusive, rarely venturing into the community. Those who observed him noted his increasing obsession with the domestic sphere, particularly the farmhouse, barns, and surrounding property. The house itself, filled with memories of his mother's dominance and religious strictures, became both a sanctuary and a laboratory for his burgeoning macabre experiments. One of the most significant behavioral changes during this period was EDS' deepening preoccupation with corpses. His prior fascination with animal anatomy and graveyards, cultivated during adolescence, began to manifest in more intense and dangerous ways. Ed started visiting local cemeteries at night, initially out of curiosity and later with a deliberate intent to exhumate the recently buried. These acts were not driven solely by sexual impulses, they were part of a complex psychological pattern in which control, obsession, and fantasy converged. EDS' desire to possess and manipulate the physical forms of the dead became an outlet for impulses that had been suppressed for decades under his mother's strict moral code. It was during these years that Edward began experimenting with the human body in increasingly grotesque ways. Historical accounts indicate that he collected bones, skulls, and other remains from graves, which he would clean, study, and arrange within his home. This practice reflected not only a fascination with mortality but also a need for mastery over life and death, an attempt to impose order on the chaos of existence. The meticulous nature of these activities foreshadowed the precision and methodical planning that would characterize his later crimes. In addition to corpse-related activities, Ed exhibited compulsive behaviors related to female forms. Having been taught by his mother to fear and despise women, Ed nonetheless developed an obsession with them. He began creating mannequins and figures, often modifying materials found in the home, to construct representations of women. These figures were not casual dolls but rather detailed constructions that allowed him to act out fantasies of control and possession. Psychologists later suggested that these early experiments were a precursor to his necrophilic tendencies, demonstrating a need to objectify and manipulate women in a controlled environment. EDS interactions with the outside world during this period were minimal. He had few social contacts and avoided relationships with women entirely. Any engagement with the community was superficial. He would attend local stores or church services sporadically, but his primary focus remained the farmhouse and his macabre interests. This extreme isolation allowed his behaviors to escalate without interference or observation. In a small rural town like Plainfield, suspicion was minimal, and Ed's outwardly polite and unassuming demeanor provided a perfect cover for his increasingly deviant activities. Psychologically, the period following Augusta's death can be described as a transition from repression to unrestrained exploration of forbidden impulses. Edward's internalized guilt, fear, and obsession, once moderated by maternal control, now had free rein. He began constructing a mental and physical world in which he could exercise total control over death, anatomy, and female forms. This world was meticulously organized, combining elements of ritual, obsession, and practical experimentation. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced his sense of mastery over life and death. One particularly striking aspect of this period was Ed's use of the domestic space as a laboratory. Rooms in the farmhouse were repurposed for the storage of bones, body parts, and anatomical curiosities. Items from the farm, tools, animal hides, and household materials were adapted for use in his experiments. This blending of domesticity and morbidity created a dissonance that was both practical and symbolic. The familiar, safe environment of the home became a site of transgression and horror. By the late 1940s, Edward's activities had escalated beyond grave exhumation and experimentation. He had begun targeting local women, though the exact timing and number of victims remained subject to historical investigation. What is clear is that the psychological patterns established during adolescence, obsession with female forms, fascination with death, and compulsive secrecy, were now being enacted in increasingly dangerous ways. Ed's ability to compartmentalize his public and private personas enabled him to operate without arousing suspicion. To neighbors, he was the quiet, solitary man of Plainfield in his home. He was a meticulous planner and executor of macabre rituals. Ed's descent into criminality during this period was also marked by an increasing detachment from societal norms. The moral framework that had governed his behavior, based on fear of sin and maternal authority, was no longer operative. In its place, Ed constructed a personal system of rules and rituals, guided by his obsessions and compulsions rather than societal law or morality. This internal moral code allowed him to rationalize acts that were objectively abhorrent, framing them as necessary for personal gratification and control. The convergence of isolation, obsession, and newfound freedom created a dangerous feedback loop. Each act of experimentation reinforced his detachment from reality and strengthened his compulsions. His interactions with human death became more frequent and elaborate, while his construction of female figures evolved in complexity and realism. Psychologists later suggested that this period represented the crystallization of Ed's paraphilic and necrophilic tendencies, combining fantasy, ritual, and physical practice in a uniquely pathological pattern. It is also during this period that Ed began to exhibit behaviors that foreshadowed the meticulous planning of his later crimes. He would study graves, analyze patterns of burial, and observe the routines of local residents. These activities, though seemingly disconnected, were exercises in observation, patience, and control, skills that would later facilitate his ability to commit murder and evade detection. Ed's mind was increasingly oriented toward understanding and manipulating both life and death, preparing him for the transition from fantasy to action. Community awareness of Ed's behavior during this period was minimal. While some neighbors considered him odd or eccentric, no one suspected the extent of his obsessions. This lack of scrutiny, combined with Ed's outward conformity, allowed him to escalate his activities without interference. The contrast between his ordinary exterior and the extraordinary depravity of his private life would become one of the most chilling aspects of his later crimes. By 1949, Ed Gein had fully entered a phase of psychological and behavioral escalation. The death of his mother had removed the final barrier between suppressed desire and action, leaving him free to explore the darkest corners of his mind. His obsession with death, control over female forms, and compulsive rituals had become central to his daily life. These years, though largely hidden from public view, laid the groundwork for the infamous series of crimes that would later horrify the nation and immortalize Ed Gein in criminal history. This period of Ed Gein's life illustrates the complex interplay of psychological, environmental, and personal factors that can contribute to extreme criminal behavior. Isolation, trauma, obsessive tendencies, and unrestrained impulses combined to produce a uniquely disturbed individual. The death of Augusta Gein was not merely a familial loss, it was the catalyst that allowed decades of repressed desires, fears, and obsessions to manifest in the real world, setting the stage for a reign of horror that would forever mark the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The period between 1947 and 1957 represents the darkest chapter of Edward Gein's life. during which his long-standing obsessions with death, anatomy, and female control manifested in real acts of murder. While historians continue to debate the exact number of his victims, the confirmed crimes and the horrifying nature of his actions have left an indelible mark on American criminal history. Understanding the specifics of these murders provides crucial insight into both the psychology of Edward Gein and the societal context that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Edward's transition from grave robber and collector of macabre artifacts to active murderer was gradual but inevitable. His psychological profile, formed over decades of isolation, maternal domination, and compulsive behavior, had reached a point where fantasy alone no longer sufficed. His obsession with control and domination over female forms, coupled with his fascination with death, created a dangerous convergence of impulses. While earlier activities such as exhuming bodies and creating female figures served as outlets for these desires, Edward increasingly sought living victims to fulfill the escalating demands of his compulsions. The first confirmed murder attributed to Ed Gein occurred in the late 1940s. While the exact date and identity of all early victims remain uncertain, authorities later documented at least 2 confirmed homicides, accompanied by grave robbing and extensive necrophilic activity. EDS methods were meticulous and calculated, reflecting his need for control and precision. He often lured women under various pretenses, sometimes through personal acquaintance, sometimes by exploiting the rural community's trust in him. Once isolated, he would execute his plans with careful attention to the physical and psychological dynamics of his victims. One of the most notorious victims was Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner. Hogan's disappearance prompted initial suspicion but did not immediately lead authorities to suspect Edward. It was later discovered that Ed had killed Hogan and kept her body, using it in rituals and for anatomical study. This pattern, targeting socially known women, committing murder, and integrating the remains into his private world, was emblematic of EDS modus operandi. He did not simply kill, he transformed the act of murder into an extension of his existing compulsions, combining necrophilia, control, and the creation of macabre objects from human remains. Another confirmed victim was Bernice Worden, a hardware store owner whose disappearance in the 1950s eventually led to EDS capture. Worden's murder marked a culmination of years of escalation. Ed had meticulously planned the act, exploiting the trust of the community and the isolation of rural life. After killing Worden, he used her body in ways consistent with his earlier patterns: dismemberment, preservation, and the transformation of her remains into items for personal use. This act not only exemplified his compulsive rituals but also highlighted the degree of psychological detachment he maintained, treating the human body as material to be manipulated rather than as a person. The methods Edward employed were as horrifying as they were methodical. He utilized tools and techniques adapted from his experiences on the farm, his experiments with animal carcasses, and his study of human anatomy. Blunt instruments, knives, and ropes were used with precision, reflecting his desire for control and efficiency. The victims were often restrained or incapacitated in ways that minimized resistance, a testament to his calculated approach. After the murders, he meticulously cleaned and preserved certain body parts, transforming them into household objects, masks, and clothing. These creations were not mere souvenirs but manifestations of his psychological need to possess, dominate, and immortalize the female form. The psychological underpinnings of EDS crimes were complex. Experts later identified elements of necrophilia, fetishism, and psychopathy in his behavior. His actions were driven not solely by sexual desire but by a combination of obsessive-compulsive tendencies, deep-seated fear of women as imposed by his mother, and an overwhelming need for control. The murder of living women provided both the raw material for his compulsions and a sense of power that he had been denied throughout his life. Each act reinforced his pathological worldview, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of obsession, murder, and ritual. EDS' selection of victims was not random. He focused on women who fit specific physical and social criteria, often targeting those who were solitary or vulnerable. This pattern reflected both his desire for control and the practical considerations of minimizing detection. Despite the horrific nature of his actions, Ed operated largely undetected for years, in part due to his unassuming demeanor and the rural isolation of Plainfield. Neighbors describe him as quiet, polite, and somewhat eccentric, traits that allowed him to mask the extraordinary depravity of his private life. The combination of physical violence, ritualistic behavior, and post-mortem manipulation of the bodies made EDS crimes particularly chilling. He did not simply kill, he integrated the act into a broader psychological and physical framework, creating a world in which death, sexuality, and control were intertwined. Items constructed from human remains included masks, suits, and other macabre objects, reflecting both his necrophilic tendencies and his obsession with embodying the women he could not possess in life. These artifacts were meticulously crafted, demonstrating patience, skill, and a chilling detachment from moral and ethical norms. Community awareness of EDS activities was limited until the mid-1950s. Early disappearances were noticed but not connected to him, in part due to his outward conformity and the general trust inherent in small-town rural life. Law enforcement at the time lacked the forensic resources to identify or link subtle patterns of behavior, allowing EDS activities to continue unchecked. This period highlights not only the cunning and secrecy of the perpetrator, but also the social and technological limitations that enabled such crimes to persist. In addition to the murders themselves, EDS' psychological profile during this period was characterized by an increasing compulsion to immerse himself in the dead. His home became both a sanctuary and a shrine to his obsessions. The interweaving of murder, necrophilic practice, and ritualistic behavior demonstrates a unique pathological pattern. EDS crimes were not impulsive or chaotic but carefully integrated into his private world. Each act served a dual purpose, satisfying compulsions while reinforcing his control over death and the female form. The arrest of Ed Gein in 1957 followed the disappearance of Bernice Worden and a meticulous investigation that revealed the depth of his crimes. While the public was initially shocked by the number of murders, the most horrifying discovery was the extent of his post-mortem practices. Law enforcement found human remains integrated into household items, evidence of grave robbing, and an array of objects that demonstrated both technical skill and profound psychological disturbance. The scale and nature of these crimes were unprecedented in American history at the time, establishing Ed Gein as one of the most infamous serial killers in the nation. The investigation also highlighted EDS' methodical approach. His meticulous organization, the hidden nature of his activities, and the precision of his crimes made detection difficult. He had transformed his home into a controlled environment, where each element, from the arrangement of body parts to the construction of macabre objects, served a functional purpose in his compulsive rituals. Psychologists later analyzed these behaviors as indicative of obsessive-compulsive disorder, necrophilia, and severe personality pathology, providing insight into the complex interplay of mental illness and criminality. Ed Gein's murders had a profound impact on the community and on criminal psychology. The shocking combination of violence, necrophilia, and ritualistic behavior challenged existing frameworks for understanding serial homicide. Experts emphasize the need to consider not only overt acts of violence but also the underlying psychological and environmental factors that contribute to extreme criminal behavior. In EDS' case, decades of maternal domination, social isolation, obsessive tendencies, and uncontrolled impulses coalesced into a pattern of horrific acts that would forever mark his name in criminal history. The legacy of EDS murders extends beyond the immediate horror of his victims. His crimes influenced law enforcement procedures, forensic investigation, and the study of criminal psychology. They also permeated popular culture, inspiring films, books, and documentaries that explored the terrifying intersection of obsession, isolation, and violence. From Hitchcock's Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the cultural footprint of Ed Gein's crimes is unmistakable, demonstrating the enduring fascination and horror elicited by his actions. The discovery of Edward Gein's crimes in 1957 marked a turning point not only in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, but in the broader understanding of American criminality. The shocking revelations exposed a level of depravity that stunned law enforcement, psychologists, and the general public alike. The catalyst for discovery was the disappearance of Bernice Worden. Initial investigations were routine but soon pointed toward Edward Gein. When authorities arrived at the Gein farmhouse, they encountered a scene that defied imagination. Human remains incorporated into household objects, skulls fashioned into bowls, skin crafted into masks, and entire torsos preserved and displayed. Investigators also found evidence linking Gein directly to the murder of Bernice Worden. Ed Gein was arrested without resistance. He did not deny involvement, and during questioning, he provided information about both the murders and the exhumed corpses from local cemeteries. The discovery of Gein's crimes had a profound impact on the community. Residents of Plainfield, many of whom had known Ed for years as a quiet neighbor, were shocked by the revelations. Media coverage amplified the shock. Psychologists and criminologists examined EDS' underlying factors: maternal domination, social isolation, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and psychosexual disturbances. Edward Gein's trial commenced after psychiatric evaluations determined that he was competent to stand trial but suffered from severe mental disturbances, including schizophrenia. Psychiatrists testified about the formative impact of Augusta Gein's extreme religiosity and his obsessive-compulsive behaviors. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the murders and meticulous planning. Evidence included witness accounts, forensic findings, and the arrangement of human remains in his home. Edward remained largely detached during proceedings, providing factual accounts without apparent emotion. Ultimately, the court determined that Edward Gein was legally insane. He was convicted of the murder of Bernice Worden and committed to a psychiatric facility, where he spent the remainder of his life. Life in institutional confinement provided structure and containment. Psychiatrists documented that his obsessions persisted, but without access to the materials that facilitated his crimes. Gein remained a subject of study for criminal psychologists, contributing to knowledge of obsessive-compulsive disorders, necrophilia, and extreme deviant behavior. He died in 1984, after nearly 3 decades under supervision. Edward Gein's crimes, trial, and subsequent imprisonment left an enduring mark not only on the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, but on American culture, criminal psychology, and the broader understanding of human deviance. Though confined to a psychiatric institution until his death in 1984, the implications of his actions reverberated far beyond his immediate life, influencing law enforcement practices, forensic studies, and the portrayal of serial killers in literature, film, and media. The legacy of Gein's life and crimes offers insight into the intersections of psychology, morality, and society's fascination with the macabre. One of the most immediate impacts of Gein's notoriety was its effect on popular culture. Filmmakers, writers, and artists drew inspiration from the grotesque specifics of his crimes. Perhaps the most famous example is Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film Psycho, in which Norman Bates, a character combining maternal obsession with murderous tendencies, reflects elements of Gein's psychological profile. Similarly, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, features Leatherface, a character known for wearing masks made of human skin, a direct parallel to Gein's use of human remains. The combination of horror, psychological disturbance, and ritualistic murder in these fictional accounts introduced audiences to the idea that extreme criminal behavior could emerge from deeply disturbed domestic and psychological environments. Beyond entertainment, Gein's crimes influenced criminal profiling and forensic investigation. Law enforcement agencies recognized the importance of understanding the psychological underpinnings of serial offenders, particularly those who operate in isolated environments and exhibit obsessive-compulsive or psychosexual tendencies. Gein's ability to blend into the rural community while secretly committing heinous acts highlighted the challenges of detection, emphasizing the need for careful observation of behavioral patterns and attention to subtle warning signs. Criminologists began to incorporate psychological analysis into investigative techniques, using behavioral profiling to anticipate potential actions and identify high-risk individuals. The academic study of Gein's behavior contributed significantly to the fields of forensic psychology and psychiatry. Researchers analyzed the convergence of environmental factors, early trauma, and mental illness in producing extreme deviant behavior. Gein's life demonstrated how prolonged maternal domination, social isolation, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and repressed psychosexual development could culminate in acts of extreme violence. Scholars emphasize that understanding the formative factors behind such behavior was essential not only for criminal prevention but also for the development of effective mental health interventions. Gein's case also raised ethical and philosophical questions regarding culpability, moral responsibility, and the treatment of mentally ill offenders. His conviction for murder and commitment to a psychiatric institution highlighted the legal system's struggle to balance justice with the recognition of profound mental disturbance. Debates surrounding the insanity defense, psychiatric evaluation, and the appropriate conditions for institutionalization were informed, in part, by the unique circumstances of Gein's crimes. The case prompted reflection on societal responsibility, the limits of legal punishment, and the challenges of rehabilitation for individuals with severe psychological pathology. Public fascination with Gein persisted long after his death. His story has been retold in documentaries, true crime literature, and academic studies, reflecting a broader cultural obsession with the psychology of extreme deviance. The combination of horror, pathology, and meticulous criminal behavior captured the imagination of audiences, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked obsession and social isolation. Gein became a symbol of the hidden darkness that can exist beneath seemingly ordinary appearances, a reminder that monstrous behavior may remain invisible until it manifests in catastrophic ways. The ethical implications of Gein's influence on culture are multifaceted. On one hand, his story has provided valuable insights for law enforcement, psychology, and criminology. On the other hand, the sensationalization of his crimes raises questions about the potential for glorification and exploitation of real-life suffering. Media portrayals, films, and books inspired by Gein's life walk a fine line between education, cautionary storytelling, and entertainment, reflecting society's complex relationship with extreme criminality. Gein's legacy also underscores the importance of early intervention in cases of extreme isolation, trauma, and psychological disturbance. Retrospective analysis suggests that prolonged maternal domination, combined with social seclusion and obsessive tendencies, created conditions in which pathology could escalate unchecked. Understanding these factors has informed approaches to child psychology, mental health support, and community engagement, emphasizing the need to address the root causes of deviant behavior before it manifests in violence. Despite the passage of decades, the cultural resonance of Gein's crimes remains strong. His influence is evident in countless fictionalized accounts of serial killers, from literature to film, where themes of maternal obsession, isolation, and necrophilia continue to captivate audiences. True crime enthusiasts, criminologists, and psychologists alike examine his case to understand the intersections of environment, mental illness, and criminality. Gein's life serves as a grim reminder of the extreme outcomes of psychological disturbance left unchecked, while also offering a framework for understanding, predicting, and preventing similar behaviors. In addition to his influence on popular culture and criminal study, Gein's case prompted practical reforms in law enforcement and forensic science. Investigators recognized the need for specialized training to identify patterns of deviant behavior, particularly in rural or socially isolated contexts. The importance of detailed observation, psychological evaluation, and forensic analysis became clear, influencing protocols for serial crime investigation in the United States and beyond. Gein's case, with its combination of bizarre artifacts, ritualistic behavior, and hidden violence, provided an unparalleled example of the challenges posed by a methodical and psychologically complex offender. Psychologically, Gein's life serves as a case study in the effects of isolation, trauma, and obsessive-compulsive disorder on human behavior. His compulsions, ritualistic use of corpses, and fixation on female forms exemplify the extreme outcomes of psychological disturbance exacerbated by environmental and social factors. Scholars have used his case to examine the development of paraphilic disorders, the role of maternal influence in personality formation, and the mechanisms by which repressed desire and fear can manifest in violent action. These insights have informed both therapeutic strategies and preventative measures for at-risk individuals. Edward Gein died in 1984, confined to a psychiatric institution, having spent nearly 3 decades under supervision. His death marked the end of a life defined by isolation, obsession, and extreme criminal behavior. Yet his legacy continues to resonate, not only in popular culture but also in the fields of psychology, criminology, and law. His story serves as both a warning and a point of study, a cautionary tale of what can result when psychological disturbance intersects with opportunity, secrecy, and obsession. In reflecting on Gein's impact, it is clear that his influence extends far beyond the immediate horror of his crimes. He shaped cultural narratives about the hidden dangers of the seemingly ordinary, influenced the methods and strategies of law enforcement, and contributed to the academic understanding of the psychological roots of extreme criminal behavior. His life and actions remain a source of fascination, horror, and scholarly inquiry, illustrating the enduring relevance of one of America's most infamous serial killers. In conclusion, the legacy of Edward Gein is multifaceted. His crimes shocked a community, captivated a nation, and influenced generations of psychologists, criminologists, and storytellers. Through the lens of his life, society can examine the interplay between environment, trauma, and mental illness, while also confronting the cultural fascination with extreme deviance. Though confined and ultimately deceased, the shadow of Gein's life continues to loom large, a reminder of both the depths of human pathology and the importance of vigilance, understanding, and ethical reflection in the face of extraordinary criminal behavior.